Hello, this is Jack Tutor from Attention Magazine. Welcome to Crucial Listening. My guest this time is Jon Mueller, a composer and percussionist from Wisconsin who creates incredible music, was formerly in the band Pele, and has been involved in numerous other projects as well. And I've loved Jon's music for like the past 3 years. I discovered him through the album Non-Fiction, which he released through his Death Blues project. And I love the moments on that record where repetition is used to the extent that the material that you're listening to and your method of connection with it completely transforms. If you were to compare the moment at which you first hear a particular refrain and then your sensations 3 minutes into that same idea, it's like a completely different sound. I just love his approach. His combination of percussion and voice that runs throughout so much of his work. You can check out Jon's stuff on rhythmplex.com, also rhythmplex.bandcamp.com. And if you want more information on any of the choices that Jon made today, please head over to attentionmagazine.co.uk/crucial listening. Usually I start with a little clean intro where I say, hello, welcome to Crucial Listening, and then we start talking from there. But Jon and I started talking from the moment that I called him, and the conversation was so interesting that I decided to basically pick up from the moment I pressed record. Jon had just recently done a performance for gongs at Ironwood Yoga Studio in Wisconsin. And so we start by talking about his experiences playing with gongs. So please enjoy this episode. Please like the podcast, subscribe to the podcast, give it a good rating, all that stuff. And without further ado, Jon Mueller on Crucial Listening.
I've been slowly acquiring gongs over the years, and at this point, I feel like I have kind of a full load. I mean, it's certainly I could get more, but I feel like it's. I just kind of glancing over at my setup now, and it's. I mean, it's it's enough. I think it's a lot. It's a lot of gongs, but yeah, I like it. It's a nice change of pace from the sort of the more high energy stuff I do with the drums. It's nice to have kind of still do percussion, but have a different approach to it and try different, it's a different sound. And so one of the things I've been sort of trying to understand with drums is how can I keep developing this without just getting bigger and more intense and more, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like, I don't necessarily want to start playing drums quietly or something. So I feel like this is a way to sort of do that without, kind of really shifting gears. My concern with like doing a different approach with drums at this point in time is that it just wouldn't come across. It would just, I don't know. For me personally, I mean, whatever other people think, but like for me, it would just feel like it would sort of represent this, like, I'm getting tired or something,
Right.
I don't want to make that call quite yet. So So gongs are a good way to sort of step into a different approach like that, softer playing, but still have this really kind of intense sound. I mean, they're, playing in a region like I did. I can't remember what I'll explain to you about this, but basically, Wisconsin has this arm on the right side of it that is a peninsula that goes into Lake Michigan, and so it's kind of it's a very rural region. Very different culturally from, say, the city where I live now. But it's interesting to hear how people react to different contexts. So gongs, I mean, they can on one hand be very meditative and soothing and beautiful, but if you play them just a little bit stronger and a little bit, for a longer duration, I mean, they're essentially noise. They're essentially kind of dissonant, very complex, a lot of sounds happening at one time, different frequencies and things. So for certain audiences, it can come off as sort of disturbing. And I think there was definitely some reactions like that when I did it last time. I didn't see it, but people were saying that there was at one point, like, people were all laying down. At one point, some people like kind of got up and looked around and maybe even kind of plugged their ears because they were just sort of confused, like, is this okay? Like, is this supposed to be happening? And that's great because, that's kind of what it's always been about to me. It's like creating situations where people are just like, what's happening to me right now? Like, is this supposed to be happening? And kind of defying, like, those, what's normal and what's supposed to be happening. I think with a lot of music, it's designed to sort of create this community around some kind of good feeling, there's nothing wrong with that. But I've always kind of liked the idea of the complexity of that question, and like, what does feel good and why does it feel good, and does everyone agree that it feels good, and well, what does that mean? So I think gongs are a cool way to deal with that and sort of play around with those ideas, similarly to what I do with drum stuff. So
it's really interesting, like, that you say people, I mean, because I looked at the pictures of that gig that you played and people lying down, and I think I don't know at what point of the performance those pictures were taken, but people looked relatively tranquil at that point, at least. But it's funny that there is that jolt upright moment where, I mean, I've been in situations before where I've maybe been lying down or maybe been of a certain relaxed posture and then sprung up, and it's like there's no real danger, but in some sense there must be something there which is like, I need to just have my wits about me here, because what's this guy doing? And that's quite an interesting thing to play with, I think. I mean, I went to see Francisco Lopez, and he did one of these blindfold performances, and he prefaced it by saying things are going to get loud and a bit crazy, but I've got everything under control, which made me more concerned that I'd never really factored in the fact that he might not.
Yeah.
But that's really, and I noticed as well, actually, because I guess as well, because you're doing it in like a yoga studio.
Yeah.
Which I wondered if that comes with its own sort of loaded expectations of what people are going to come away with.
Yeah, and I that's kind of one of my interests in doing more things along those lines, because it's not a musical setting. It's not coming with the expectations of the social aspect of music, where people are there to engage socially as part of some kind of scene, and possibly just it's part music, but it's also part hanging out and having drinks and the social side of it. And I'm really interested at this point, I guess, with where my work has gone, in taking it out of that context entirely, if possible, and just trying to present it in different situations, not as any sort of statement on people need to take it more seriously or something, but I don't quite understand it yet, but I don't think it fits in the same context. I think it requires a different kind of situation for it to really work, to have the intended effect and have the result from at least from some of the feedback I've gotten from people, I don't think that that kind of feedback would happen if it was like in a noisy club with, bottles getting thrown out in the background and people chatting in the background. And I just think it's that situation works for very specific kinds of music. And I just don't feel like I'm in that right now. So it's really so much more about music than what the music scene allows it to be. Everything is so specific and it's so formatted and yeah, I'm interested in seeing like what else is possible. So I think like an audience at a yoga studio, like people who would normally go there for yoga, when they hear of something like this, it's not that they're interested in going to see a band play. They're interested in a similar kind of whatever their internal transformative experience that they're looking for that studio to provide them. They're looking for something similar for that to happen. And so I think, adding an instrument as the background to that, it's kind of an interesting thing. It's something I'm definitely curious about and being involved in and being a part of that and having the work I do pertain to that as opposed to just being like, all right, everyone watch me play my instrument now and, judge accordingly. When people aren't even watching you play, when they're just really absorbing this experience of how they're interpreting these sounds and what these sounds are conjuring for them internally is a cool thing. I mean, it sort of points back to childhood experiences that I've had with records, where I didn't understand what the live experience necessarily was because I hadn't really seen any, but I was completely absorbed in records and the effect that they had on me and this whole sort of world that they would create internally for me. That's where it all began. Like that's where my whole interest in this stuff began. And it was important enough that it's not something I feel like I need to move on from. That as I've gotten older, it's like, I don't need to like forget about that. I still think that's sort of the core of what music is for me. And I would assume most people, I don't know. I mean, I just think somewhere along the way, as we get older and we get to engage more with live music, that maybe got lost. And I'm probably more so for people who, like me, got into records at a really young age, as opposed to, say, discovering it in your teens in conjunction with seeing live music. I mean, I think maybe that the impression would be different then. But, for so many years, I lived in nothing but records, and records became these little films inside my head. And films is maybe even a small way to put it. I mean, it really became parts of records became parts of my personality, I think. I mean, I really sort of felt in some ways like I was living through the records, and probably in dangerous ways sometimes. I mean, probably not realistic at all, but it was very real to me, and I think probably helped me in many ways.
That leads nicely into the main segment of why you're here, I guess, Jon, which is to discuss 3 records that you consider to be important. I understand from the email exchange that we've had prior to this that it seems that you could have picked any number of records. There wasn't a definitive 3 that sprung to mind. So what was your process for finalizing 3 that you wanted to talk about today?
Yeah, when you first talked to me about doing this, it's one of those topics that my gut reaction is I'm excited about thinking about that. But then my very next thought for any topic like around favorites or pick 3 or pick 5, it's terrifying to me because there's so many different kinds of records that I can identify for very different reasons. And so, I kind of got a little freaked out, like almost to the point of just like, maybe I should tell Jack I just can't do this because it's too specific or something. But then I thought, all right, just don't think about it for a while. I kind of, put it out of my head for a bit. And then one day I was on a walk and I thought, okay, just pick 3 off the top of your head, like really quickly. Don't put too much thought into it. What are 3 that sort of have some kind of significance that come to mind, the first three. And so I picked those, and I thought, okay, I know why I picked each of those, and I'll go with those. And so I thought, as soon as I get back from this walk, I'm going to send Jack a note, and that'll be it. And then, of course, I did that, and I felt good about it. And then, the next thing, oh man, I should have picked this. And I was talking to my wife yesterday, and I was like, oh, I really should have told him this one. And I was like, oh, and she's like, well, you can, it's the day before, you can write him. And I was like, no. I can't get into that. I just have to stick with this and go with it. So
yeah, that's a dangerous start of something, isn't it, if you start revising it. If you wouldn't mind introducing your first pick, I'll let you choose the ordering, but if you could just introduce it and then speak a bit about why that particular record is important to you.
Yeah, so the first record I picked was The Magician's Birthday by Uriah Heep, and that was a record that my parents had when I was really young, and which is kind of my introduction to music, and how I got into music was my parents' records. And this was like early 70s. Clearly the kind of rock music that was happening during that time was what my parents were into, and so that was kind of it. And like, I don't know if it was, it came from music or if it came from something else, but like I was always into scary things. So like anything that was like, scary movies or scary books or, just scary stuff. Like I was always attracted to that. And so like the records that they would have that had any implication of some kind of scariness to it, be it in the cover art or, really, usually the cover art. Like I was attracted to those. So Uriah Heep, The Magician's Birthday record it's got a kind of a psychedelic cover. It uses this sort of neon red and blue that sort of play this almost eye trick with you. If you stare at certain parts long enough, it does this kind of flashing effect, which is another part of the story I'll get into. But it's got this kind of interesting cover of this sort of like weird fantasy land with these strange plant growth things and these three characters. So there's the magician, and then there's this demon thing who the magician is, potentially having some kind of battle with or about to have some kind of battle with. And then there's this like strange plant that's like part plant, part woman. That was always intriguing to me too, who's just kind of sitting in the scene off to the side, and she's sort of observing this battle. And I just remember like being a kid and seeing that cover and just really kind of getting absorbed in what was going on in that world and what was this scene all about. So, again, it's probably been talked to death, but like the importance of record cover art and the effect that particularly 70s record cover art and what happened during that time. It's pretty phenomenal. So that was like, that's what drew me to the record. And then listening to the record, it identified everything I was looking for as a kid. It was had some heavier parts, great guitar sound. But what started to become apparent, this record was really the beginning of me identifying things about music that appealed to me. And Ken Hensley, who was, one of the principal writers in the group at that time, he played keyboards and guitar. He had this great knack for writing these really great hooks using minor keys. And they would go, Uriah Heep songs, the good ones, in my opinion, have this sort of consistent major key writing style, and then like during a bridge or the chorus or something, it'll switch to this very sort of dramatic minor key notation instead, and it's just this very sort of dramatic, powerful, really grabs you. And as a kid, those parts just were like identified music, like what about music I was really, really interested in. And I thought, why don't more people do this? Why do more bands, like whatever it is? And as a kid, I didn't understand what they were doing, but I was like, why don't more bands sound like that? Like, why don't more people do that. And it always intrigued me. And as I got older, when I got older and started discovering music from other countries, and realizing that in other countries, like, all the music sounded like that, and all of it was in minor keys, and particularly more Middle Eastern region stuff. It was like, oh man, like they figured it out, So, but that's one of the reasons why that record is so important to me. Musically, artistically, it just had all these components that really appealed to me. On a more personal level, I don't even know how to necessarily define all this, but records throughout my life have become symbols of things. And I would say that record somehow, that band really became a symbol, not only of memories of my childhood, but particularly somehow a relationship with my dad that really became a symbol for that. And I don't know really specifically how that came to be, but it did. And so that record being the first one I'd heard from that group, it sort of stands out as this, like, it's a very clear symbol, and always will be. I mean, every time, for the rest of my life, if I see that record cover, it represents not just this music, but this part of my family, my life. And for me, that makes it very important.
I've seen you write, I can't remember where it was, maybe Drowned in Sound, about the fact that there were periods of your life where you only listened to this record.
There was a time when it was almost a year, probably. It was maybe 10 months or so, where I only listened to Uriah Heep. I didn't listen, it was on purpose. It was, I said I'm not going to listen to anything else except for this band until this certain event happened. And the event didn't happen, and I thought, it was sort of my idealistic goal that I would listen to nothing until I could reconnect with my dad. And it got to the point where I just realized that it probably wasn't going to happen in a reasonable time, and realized that it was starting to get kind of insane with this music, and I just needed to just forget it and move musically and not get out of this world I was sort of creating with this. And it was really was that. It was like creating this sort of, again, it's this fantasy. It's this, using music to sort of create this, like, ideological fantasy world within that represents some sort of ideals that I had, or, what was going to be and how things would be. And, when I read, and I thought, this is how it's all going to work, and, I'm going to listen to nothing but this, and then there's going to be some kind of reunion, and there will be this, like, this music will then become this, like, magical symbol of this whole event, and then when I realized it potentially could be years and years, I just thought, well, I can't, it's this crazy, I gotta get out of this, so I did, but yeah.
Have you listened to it since?
Oh yeah. I have multiple copies of it, and I still listen to the group occasionally. I kind of go in phases with it, and they have a lot of great records. They have a lot of really, records that I'm not interested in at all. But they have one original member, Mick Box, and they still tour. And I see them every time they come to Milwaukee, and they're phenomenal. They're just a great band. And it's if I had just been introduced to them last week, I'd probably have a completely different feel about it. But it's so embedded in my DNA. It's so a part of who I am, because of the history and what I did with the music, like what I used it for internally. And it's almost beyond, I almost can't even describe what it is. I mean, it's absolutely profound, the role that has played in my life.
Can you recall, I mean, because you mentioned that the kind of heaviness of the sound was something that appealed to you as a child, which I think myself and probably a lot of other people can relate to. Like, heaviness is such a exciting thing, I think, for a lot of people when they first encounter something that breaches that boundary of what they think is possible in terms of heaviness and density in rock music. But what about because there's a lot of much softer, I guess, more ballad-centric moments on this. I mean, did you connect to those as a kid? Do you know whether that had as much of a potent reaction with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, it was really more about, I mean, the heaviness was definitely an appeal, but the way that they worked with these minor keys was the sound of that really was fascinating to me. And maybe it was just, that stuff, but like in combination with their aesthetic that they used on that record cover, it really implied this like sort of mystical world to me, this sort of like strange, surreal fantasy world. And so, of course, with that, you start developing ideas about who these people are and what kind of lives they live and what it's like. And of course, in my mind, it wasn't this like, rock and roll debauchery that it probably actually was, particularly since most of the members died from, drugs or alcohol. But no, I shouldn't say most, but a few of them did. And there was issues in surviving members too. But yeah, it's just like, for me, it was just this portal into this other dimension. And so even the more ballady stuff, it was just beautiful to me. And because it wasn't this like nice, pretty, happy, I mean, a lot of it was very sad and had this sort of darkness to it that felt good. It didn't feel negative. It didn't feel, destructive or troubling at all. It was sort of this reaffirming. It was this positive feeling. That sort of sadness felt very positive to me.
I'm wondering, with maybe you're close to it beyond the point where you can answer this question, but can you feel the impact of Uriah Heep or this record on maybe any decisions or sensibilities you've developed as a composer?
I don't know. It's hard to say because it's so radically different from the stuff I do. But I would say, there was definitely times in working with melody over the years in different groups that I would have wanted those elements to come into play, but they just, they weren't of interest by others in the groups. So, but I mean, any time I worked with any kind of melody, I mean, I do like to include that kind of feel to melody that I use. So, but not, all the percussion based stuff that I do, it's certainly it's in there. I mean, it's such a part of who I am, but, yeah, I guess it probably just comes out in different ways that I just don't know. But I'm sure like everything influences everything. And as heavily as I was into that band for so many years, I mean, it's going to come out somehow. It's going to be in the mix of how I'm thinking about things. I just don't know. There's no direct correlation of like, oh yes, so I listened to this record and that made me think of this. So when I write drums, I always do this. It's not that direct. But yeah, it's a part of my sensibility, I think, now.
And do you have a favorite track?
I like Echoes in the Dark. Tales is great too. Yeah, I don't know. I would say that the whole record is great, except for the one the happy song written by Mick Box, which was, I think, Spider Woman. I mean, it's just more of this kind of like boogie rock song, and it's fine, but it's just like I could do without it. It's like the record is so great outside of that. It's the odd track. It's the one that pops up that's just like, well, I guess we'll put that one on. I'm not sure why they did that, but that's just my opinion, of course. But
yeah.
The whole record is, I think it fits exactly this very certain mood, and that's the one song that kind of takes it in this other direction, which is probably okay. As a group, I'm sure they're like, all right, like we have a complex range of songs that we like, and I get it. It's not my band.
Yeah. No, I mean, I've listened to the record a couple of times since you recommended it. I put it forward for this list, and that one's got a kind of finger snappy sort of groove to it, which definitely caught my ear.
Yeah, it may have even been the label saying, like, maybe they were looking for like more of an upbeat radio song, or I mean, who knows what goes on.
What must be done in just one short night. And if you ask, then you must know. If you still doubt, you should be told. It was not we that made it so. It was by those who went before.
So I'd love to have your next important album then.
Yeah, so I'm realizing now that after I talk about this next one, following what I just talked about, I'm really painting myself into potentially having some sort of issues, but here we go. So the next record I chose was, it's called Family Album by Fawn Fables. Now, this is a newer record, came out in the 2000s, but this, and I sort of picked this as a reaction to this Uriah Heep record because something similar happened. So because this came out in more recent times, there was something very specific about this record that was very similar to what happened with Uriah Heep. So Fawn Fables, I think I saw them. So I used to run a record label called Crouton. I put out a record by Matthew Waldron, and Matt was friends with this group Fawn Fables, and Fawn Fables was going on tour, and Matt wrote me and said, my friends are going to be on tour. They're coming through Milwaukee. They've agreed to have my record on their merch table on their tour. So I'm wondering if you could bring a box of these to them. When they come to Milwaukee, I'll put you on the list, whatever, et cetera. So I showed up, didn't meet the band then, but, got them the CDs, saw the show, really enjoyed it. And hadn't heard of them before, and thought, I should look into their music and see what it's all about. So that at that time, I think maybe not quite then, but maybe it was. I'm not sure. But the Family Album came out sometime around then. Either they were on tour for that, or that record came out, following this tour or something. But I remember getting Family Album because I thought, okay, I want to get something by this band and see what they're all about. And so I got Family Album and started listening to it in the car when I was driving. And, it was interesting. I liked it. And there's a lot of songs on it. And something happened during this, these times when I was listening to it. And eventually I realized there was a lot of stuff about it that worked in a similar way. They also use this sort of like these dramatic shifts to these minor keys. So there was this element of that reflected some of like what appealed to me from, you know, the Uriah Heep stuff, and just the you know, outside of that, you know, for just Fawn Fables, that, I mean, lyrically and musically, it was all like really, really solid, very top notch. Like the lyrical content was interesting, and the musical writing was interesting, and the performance of everything was just really, really well done. And so Fawn Fables it's a couple. They use guest musicians also, but it's primarily this couple, Nils and Dawn, and it's such a powerful duo that they have. Like they're performing. The performances that they do together, you can tell it's just such a strong musical relationship. And so I really got absorbed by this stuff, and I realized at one point that I hadn't listened to anything else in quite a while. So every time I get in my car, this CD would be in there. And at that time I was working in another town. I had a pretty long commute. And so I was essentially listening to this record, you know, twice a day. And it went on for, I'd say, again, almost a year. And I realized I wasn't listening to any other records. I wouldn't listen to anything else at home. I would only listen to this record. And at one point I thought, all right, this is enough. I got to get something else on. And I brought another CD out into the car and started on my drive. I put this other CD on, and I got about, I don't know, maybe into the second song, and I was just like, I don't have any interest in this. And I took it out, and I put the Fawn Fables record back in, and I continued to listen to that exclusively for months.
Wow.
And nothing else. Not a single other record played either at home or in the car for, I'd say almost a year. And so that was a very strange time, because I realized that it was happening, and I had no interest in doing anything about it. I thought, it's okay. This is how it is. And I occasionally I would think like, well, where does this go? Like how, like at some point I'm going to have to listen to something else. And I just thought, I don't know if I ever will. So this is where it gets even more interesting. So they came to Milwaukee on tour, and I went to that concert, and it was great. And went home that night, and I had to work the next day, and so I didn't have a lot of sleep. You know, the show got done late, got to work, and it was just, I mean, just kind of out of it all day, really tired. And they were playing in Chicago the following night, and so I'm at work that day, and I'm, you know, part of me is just like, all I can think about is like getting back home and going to sleep early. And at some point in the day, a coworker of mine, you know, we started chatting about the show, and he's like, oh, you know, he said that sounds kind of interesting. And I'm like, well, you know, they are playing in Chicago tonight. And he's like, oh, wow. And then somehow, you know, we thought, okay, let's go. You know, if you're interested, like, let's go. And he's like, I can drive. And I was like, that's great. Let's do it. So we left from work. We went down and saw them in Chicago. And it was really great there too. I was completely out of my mind. I mean, I was so tired, but, the show got done. We were all kind of standing around afterward. And there was a point where I saw Dawn kind of standing off by, you know, she was done chatting with some people. She was kind of standing. It was an opportunity to go and talk to her. So I went up to her, introduced myself, and I said, you know, a while back, I put out your friend Matt's record, and you guys were nice enough to take them on tour and, you know, sell the CDs on tour. And you know, I appreciated that. And she was like, oh yeah, okay. Yeah. I know who you are, and this and that. And so, you know, we were just kind of chatting, small talking for a bit. And I there was a lull, and I kind of stopped, and I said, you know, Dawn, I have to tell you something. This is really important to me. I said, I haven't listened to music like yours since I was I was a kid. And it's really been, it's sort of taken over my life. I just am completely absorbed in it. And I kind of stopped talking, and she didn't say a word. She just turned around and walked away. And she walked over to this other group of people, and I thought, what just happened? And I thought, maybe someone called her and she just ran over there for a second and I didn't hear that or something. So I just kind of stood there for a little bit, and she just was with this other group of people and clearly just, now getting engaged in that conversation. And I just thought I was kind of stunned. And so then I just, walked back over to where my friend was standing, and I said, we can get going. And he was like, okay. And we left, and I was just kind of baffled and really just didn't know what happened. I didn't know if I upset her. I didn't know, I felt kind of bad. I was just like, I hope she didn't, did I say something offensive? I don't know what happened. But it didn't make me upset. I didn't feel angry or oh, well, forget it, I'm done with this group or something. It was just sort of puzzling. And I didn't feel the need to listen to it anymore. I didn't not like it. It wasn't like I turned me off to it. I just didn't. I felt like, okay, it's done now.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So, was that the last time you've listened to it?
Oh no, I've listened to it. Occasionally I'll put it on just because, they've come out with records since then, and so I've gotten those, and it's a fantastic group, because it uses some of those same musical elements that that I admired about Uriah Heep. There's that, and there's more of a folk element to it, which appeals to me, and it's great stuff. It's a great group, and there's nothing has changed for that. It's just that obsession, that isolated world that was developing, that just dissolved. It was like this. Something happened. It was some kind of thing happened where that action, her doing that action, just kind of broke the whole thing for me. It just put an end to it. It was just very strange.
Has there been any kind of interaction since, or have there been any follow up on that? No. I've just told this story to people. That's been the takeaway for it. I've gone to see them since, actually, and I just thought, it's not something I need to go talk to her about again, because then I'll be crazy. Then she'll be like, oh, this guy. What the hell? But it's a cool story, and it's a cool memory, and I think it's an interesting experience to have with a record and someone's music. And if anything, it's just a testimony to the power this stuff can have. I think people just look at music in some ways as this light, entertaining thing, and it's not just that. In some cases, it's wow. It's great. It's difficult now from my side to try and discuss this record with you, I guess, because I think now I acknowledge the extent to which there is, putting it lightly, a gulf in understanding and the ability to articulate about this album. But has there been any kind of album that's come close since to dragging you into that extent?
No.
Wow. I had experiences, I guess, as a child where I would play records and nothing else would there would be absolutely no requirement to plug myself into anything else. I felt completely fulfilled. But that hasn't happened in like 12 years. So that's incredible to hear that it's happened to you, and it's like to such an extent. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly records that, since that I love and I have really been into, but it's different. This was on this other level. This tapped specifically back into this complete sort of fantasy realm, like I experienced in childhood with particularly that Uriah Heep record, where you sort of create this whole inner world around this music and what each song represents, and the story and the sound, and what these people's lives might be like, and what, just creating these imaginary scenes around what might be happening in the life of this song, this particular song or something. It's, nothing else has done that since. And I think part of that is I don't listen to a lot of song-based music. I mean, I mostly listen to stuff that is either instrumental or, contemporary, or, outside of the folk and country stuff that I maybe listen to, none of it really operates on that level, because none of it really has, a lot of this like, this kind of more heavier, dark element to it. A lot of it is on the lighter side. So maybe that's a part of it, that it just doesn't have that depth to it or something. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, until the day comes, I'm sure there's other bands like that, that have this sound that exists. And until I find them, it'll happen again probably. And I don't know. I kind of almost don't want it. I mean, it's nice to have to look back on it, but to like be in that, it's just like, yeah, I don't know if I would wish that on myself,
I noticed one of the songs when I was listening to it, which seemed to burst in, and the energy changed a bit, and then I found out that it was the song, I think this is the title, Carousel with Madonnas? Which I understand now is a cover of a singer called Eva de Markzyk, who I checked out some of her material as well, and sounds amazing. Like, I'm surprised I haven't really heard her name before, at least not paid attention if I had. But I don't know if you've heard any of her material at all.
I haven't listened to any of it. And that's kind of ironic too, because I mean, I've sort of gone over every detail with that record, but yeah, I never sought any connection outside of that record, because I think I was just too absorbed with it to look further,
Yeah.
But maybe at this point, it's worth looking, Or it'll bring me back into that again. I don't know. Maybe I don't know.
Oh, Joshua, you're our angel, painting dreams.
If I could have your final important album, Jon, and why it's important.
The last one I chose was Dreams Less Sweet by Psychic TV. And that record is, I think it's not just an important record to me like the other two were. I think it's an important record sort of in the history of recordings. For me personally, I discovered it, I was introduced to it around, I think it was probably in 1988 or 89. I met a friend in high school who sort of opened up this whole other world of music to me. At the time, I was pretty specifically listening to hardcore punk rock stuff, and was getting at this point with it. I'd been listening to it for enough years that it was starting to feel somewhat of a dead end to me. But at the same time, I still really like believed in the music and identified with it, and didn't really know where else to go with those ideas. And so it just sort of was, and I was sort of just like holding on to this identity and this music that just for lack of direction on what to do next, I guess. And so when I met this friend and he introduced me to a variety of records that are probably all have a level of importance to them, but in particular Dreams Less Sweet, it was so unlike other stuff I was listening to. So like for instance, other music I discovered around that time, like Swans and Eistersende Neubauten and Fetus and things like that they had this heaviness to them. They had this hardness to them. And Dreams Less Sweet wasn't this like heavy. It wasn't even a rock record. It was something else, and that was interesting in and of itself. But then kind of like really like looking into what this group was about, and that it wasn't just about music, but it was about ideas and philosophy and all sorts of things that played into some of the ideas that I was interested in with punk rock, but in a completely different context, in what seemed to me a more serious and a more real context than just being pissed at stuff, just being angry about this or against certain groups of people. It was like, for me, it was the realization that there's large groups of people who are doing things that are a bit more transformative and really trying to create change outside of just being angry about stuff, and then making music about how angry they are about things. And so like the record is again sort of a symbol of that change for me. I mean, it was almost this like abrupt shift it was like I realized then I was waiting for a way out of this stuff. This, creatively, like, what else can I get into? I just didn't know the answers. This is all pre-internet. You sort of just have to, it's hard. It was harder at that time to sort of go seek out and find out what else there was. It sort of just was revealed to you in different ways. And fortunately, I was, met a person who could reveal all this stuff to me. And so that band and that record just became this other dimension that, it changed my life, really. It changed the course of how I thought about not just music, but all sorts of things. It was sort of a very profound step in my life, not just musically, but just how I thought about things and how I saw things, how I observed the system of things and how they worked and why people did the things they did and why they didn't do certain things, and how maybe that could be changed, or how you can sort of play with the way things are and make actual realities different than how they are. That became very interesting to me, and that record is what represents that shift. That record has all those things in it. I mean, even the recording process they did, it was this, it was all recorded binaurally, and so the experience of listening to it was completely different than listening to any other record. And the material in it, I mean, it's all very cut up. It's essentially a collage record, but it doesn't sound like, it's like something like Negative Land or something. It doesn't sound like that. It sounds like compositions. It's a really powerful record. And so I think personally it definitely is an important record, but I think because of what the record is, how it was made, what's in it, there's like car sounds in it, like car horns and things, and then there's recordings of playing human thigh bones, and it's just all over the place, and it's like, why all these things? And so for me, it was I think the record's important for like what it all consists of and what it is. But for me, it was really this opportunity to say, well, why that sound? Why did they include that sound? Does it have some kind of meaning? Is it important in some way? Like, why that and why this and why that? And I think, I think Genesis and he would probably say like, that's the idea. Maybe that's what they were trying to do, is like the activity that they did was sort of a way to communicate to people, try looking at everything this way, try questioning all the details and everything that you interact with, and try understanding it on a deeper level than just sort of taking it and accepting things on face value, but sort of dig underneath it and wonder about why it goes on the way it does, and why it exists the way it does, and try to understand things differently than just taking it or just getting upset about it. Or so I think it's just really an important record in general.
And all those questions of why that you posed at the record originally, I mean, do all of those whys still remain? I mean, does the record still feel beyond reach in terms of the rationality behind what you're hearing?
I think anyone, myself included, can put that record on today and understand that there is a lot going on. It's a complex record, and it's filled with mystery, and not in sort of this complex, difficult, or off-putting way, but it's a very rich experience. And again, the style of recording, it wasn't recorded in a studio. It was recorded with binaural headphones. So every sound was recorded from the perspective of the listener, which, I mean, it can sort of baffle you if you try to understand that even. But like when you're listening to all these tracks mixed together, and each of those tracks was recorded from the perspective of a listener's ears, it's really intense.
Yeah. I mean, I've listened to it quite a lot over the past few days. And a lot of those situations have actually been in public places where an interesting thing that I've felt in these early days is there almost seems to be, where some records that are collaged in nature feel very alien and very much a spectacle that I'm observing from the outside, I feel quite unsettled by the fact that Psychic TV, it seems like it has one foot on the inside as well. It seems to be a comprehension of the fact that not only that I'm going to react to telephones and car horns as I'm, walking down the high street, and those sounds have I have a response to those sounds just as a human being, but also the elements of music which sort of seem to twist things around from the center rather than in some far off corner, which has made it. I often come away from a record, I mean, even after a few listens, where I can come away with some coherent sentiment as to what I think, or a sensation that feels quite not necessarily singular but whole. But with this one, it's all over the place. Yeah.
It is all over the place, but it also feels, I mean, to me at least, it feels like a record. It doesn't, like I was saying before, even though it's essentially a collage, it doesn't feel that way. It feels somehow cohesive, and it's odd to even say that, because I'm thinking now of specific parts from the record that are just so radically different from each other. It's just a really fascinating record.
Yeah, there's some definite, almost like allusions to, like, I don't know, Beach Boys during some points, which really
the
knocked
vocal
me off
stuff.
guard. Yeah,
there's a Charles Manson cover on there, but it's done in this like it's just it's all over. But there's some really kind of for the moments that are sort of song based, it's really powerful stuff. It's kind of neat. And then of course you have things like the track In the Nursery towards the end, which is like it's disturbing. It's disturbing in terms of like what's the instrumentation. I mean, there's car horns in that too, but it's like, what is it about and what's going on? And in the context of like having heard the rest of the record, it's just like, what's behind all this? What's really going on? And again, that's what sort of pulls you into like explore what's Psychic TV all about. And so at that time too, like as I sort of started to dig in, and again, pre-internet, it was just like, where can I find more information about this? And then discovering that they were part of this like world network of the Temple of Psychic Youth. And there was these actual little, station groups throughout the world that, I didn't know what they did. What were they up to? What were they doing? And it's, it's like this whole sort of like grand scheme starts developing, and it's like, wow, what is this? And I loved it. It was like, this is so fascinating to me, coming out of just like, seeing another punk rock band, drinking beer, playing in some shitty club, and getting back in the van and hitting the road. And that's, nothing against that, but it's just like, it just seems so simple to me compared to this whole other thing going on that I hadn't heard of before. And so it just seemed way more involved and complex and interesting. And so like I said before, like it just made me completely switch gears. Like, okay, there's this whole other world out there, and life can be really, really interesting. It was like one of those records that sort of made me realize just like, there's a lot out there, and I should explore that and not just listen to the same 3 chords over and over and hear the same angry lyrics over and over. There's so much more to discover. And so yeah, it's an important record. Yeah.
I understand that 2 of the key members of this band, I guess, that featured on this record departed, I think, only within a couple of years of Dreams Less Sweet. Do you connect with any other eras or phases of Psychic TV, or anywhere they went beyond this record?
Well, yeah. So coming out of that record, not too long after that, they sort of went into their house music phase, which, was odd to me, but eventually like that became an underground thing, with the Wax Trax label in the US. I mean, it really did become something of interest to me. And so with Psych TV sort of being a part of that, I was interested in it and the culture. And again, I think, the beauty of Psychic TV, it was like they could make a radical musical change like that, but it wasn't just musical. It wasn't like, oh, hey, now we're into this kind of sound, let's make songs with house beats in them instead. It was about this whole ideology, and Genesis was interested in this whole culture of psychedelics and the philosophies around psychedelics and how it tied into stuff that they had previously explored. I mean, Genesis is such an interesting person because everything that he sort of did was, it wasn't, nothing was at face value. It was all these ideas around these things and what was going on, and not just sort of observing and being interested in them, but getting involved in not just being a part of something, but creating his own version of what that's like. And I think, Psychic TV and their revolving members and the people that were involved, and then this wider network of the Temple of Psychic Youth, and so you have all these different people sort of just working with all these different ideas. Again, it's so much more than just music. It's this bigger thing than just sound. Sound is just playing one part of the picture. It's just one facet of this bigger idea. And it's interesting how I think only certain people can pull that off on that big of a level. And for most people, it's enough to deal with a band and rehearsals and recordings and touring. I mean, that's enough work as it is. But then, for a few people, they can make it something much larger and something much grander and deal with that in a way that makes sense and is sort of this linear developing ideology and exploration that occurs over decades. It's pretty phenomenal. So I wouldn't say I'm a fan of everything that they've done or did or continue to do, but I just, it's what he's accomplished and what that group, the recordings, I respect them all. I think they're all a part of something bigger. They're not just records. They're part of something much larger.
I know that with your own projects, you've often had elements which go beyond being purely sonic in their presentation. I mean, has Psychic TV in any way been had an impression on your decision to look for other ways of presenting what you do outside of just sound?
Yeah, and that, I mean, that's why I picked this record in particular, because it marked that shift for me into thinking about things in a completely different way than just writing a song, but what the song maybe is in reference to, what the song came out of, what the, why I would play certain things in a certain way, and what that represents in this grander picture. I think, with all three of the records that I talked about, there's something to them that started with music, but then transformed into something deeper. It's the music is sort of what exists on the surface, and that's what you see. But behind it, there's this whole other kind of inner world that can develop. And I think with all three of these, there's sort of different inner worlds that were at play. But the idea that they had such sort of powerful dimensions to them outside of the music. It wasn't just like, oh man, I really love that song. Like, you look at something like, for me, like the first Hot Snakes record, which is this rock band, there's songs on that record that are just like, they'll get me every time. I can put that record on right now and just be like, man, I love that song. It just really, really feels good. And it's such a great, powerful thing. But for the records I've been talking about today, there's maybe that element to it, but then there's this much larger inner world behind it that exists that it doesn't happen with all music. It only happens with certain stuff. And these are three records that came to mind that I think do that, and have certainly influenced me to consider that in my own work. I'm not saying I'm pulling it off or I'm creating that for other people. I don't think I'm one of those people that can do that, but it's certainly inspiring, and it certainly on that level has influenced me to think about that kind of stuff in doing my own work and try to, in my own way, do some of that and at least create the possibility of a listener exploring further and not just taking the recording at face value, but using it as a doorway to something else. And only they know what that something else is. I mean, when Ken Hensley wrote those songs, when Dawn and Nils wrote those songs, when Genesis and the others, put that record together, they weren't thinking like, oh, when people hear this, they're totally going to think about X. I mean, that wasn't the case. It was, I'm sort of creating this stuff out of where they guided me and where they kind of pointed me to, and then I took it the rest of the way. And I think that's the idea. I mean, all music does that on some level, but if you can frame a record in a context that clearly leads you to a more directed. There's more of a specific direction that you're pointing toward there. Yeah, it's. I think records can act as a great introduction to something that people can discover. They just have to be led or guided to that direction in a kind of a certain way, and I think it can be tricky to pull off. I think it's just based on the history of what I've sort of always been drawn to. That's the kind of stuff I like, and if there's a way that I can try to make stuff like that, it feels good to me.
There's no plane, we can't catch the plane in time. I simply put my love with you. That plane will come out of the air. There's no way you can fly. I will take your call. Santa Claus is checking his list, going over it twice.
Well, Jon, this has been amazing. I think it's one thing to isolate down to 3 albums that you consider to be important, and another to so succinctly articulate them to someone who does not have that amassment of personal experience shrouding your own interaction with that record. So thank you so much. And if people want to check out your own projects and find out what you're up to, where's the best place for them to be heading?
My site is rhythmplex.com.
Great. I'll put that in the show notes for people, along with information around the 3 picks that Jon has made today. Jon, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
And to everyone listening, I'll speak to you soon.